It is the height of the Atlantic slave trade, and the Portuguese Empire is the most feared colonial force on earth. They have guns, warships, and a hunger for African land and African bodies that nothing seems to satisfy. The Kingdom of Ndongo has been fighting them off for nearly 50 years, and losing. By 1622, the kingdom is on its knees, its borders shattered, its people vanishing into Portuguese chains by the thousands. And into the middle of all of that, one woman is sent to do what armies could not. Her name is Nzinga. She has just crossed enemy territory, entered a city that belongs to her people's oppressors, and walked into a hall designed specifically to humiliate her before she speaks a single word. The Portuguese governor, João Correia de Sousa, sits elevated on a gilded throne, silk drapes, gold trim, the full theatrical performance of European power. And there, on the cold stone floor, directly in front of him, nothing. No chair, not even a stool, just empty floor and a silent, deliberate message. Kneel like a subject, or stand like a servant. Either way, you are beneath me. Nzinga brother, who was the Ndongo king, was too weak, too frightened, and too broken to face this moment. So he sent her instead, a woman, into the lion's den, carrying the weight of every man, woman, and child who still believed Ndongo could survive. Most people in that room expected her to hesitate. Some expected her to bow. She looked at that empty floor, snapped her fingers, and one of her attendants immediately dropped to hands and knees. Nzinga sat down, not on the floor, not in submission, but on a human throne, her back perfectly straight, her eyes locked with the governor's at the exact same level. The room went so quiet you could hear the torches burn. That one gesture said everything. I am not your subject. I am not your servant. I am your equal. And if you've forgotten that, I just reminded you. What happened next left the entire hall in stunned silence and set off 40 years of war that would make the most powerful empire in the world regret the day it ever looked down on her. Drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from? Luanda, London, and New York? And if this is your first time hearing about Queen Nzinga, welcome. You are about to meet one of the most terrifying strategic minds in the history of this world. Before we can understand the woman Nzinga became, we need to understand the world that tried to destroy her from the moment she drew her first breath. In the year 1583, the Kingdom of Ndongo, in what is now northern Angola, was already living under the shadow of Portuguese ambition. Since Paulo Dias de Novaes founded Luanda in 1575, the Portuguese had been pushing relentlessly inland, not to trade as equals, not to build friendships, but to hunt. Their economy ran on one fuel: enslaved Africans. And the fertile, strategically vital Kingdom of Ndongo sat directly in their path, like a wall they were desperate to tear down. Ndongo was no primitive backwater. It was a sophisticated state within the broader Mbundu cultural sphere, a kingdom with salt mines, master iron workers, complex diplomatic networks, and a capital city called Kabasa that hummed with political life. The king, called Angola, ruled over a web of local chiefs and commanded armies that had been defending this land for generations. These were not people waiting to be discovered. They were a nation. Ndongo was already bleeding when Nzinga was born in 1583. The Portuguese were at the gates, the kingdom was fracturing under pressure, and the future looked like nothing but darkness. And yet, from the very first breath she drew, it was clear that this particular child had not been born to surrender to any of it. According to oral tradition passed down through generations, Nzinga came into the world with her umbilical cord wrapped around her neck. In Mbundu culture, this was not seen as a bad sign. It was read as a prophecy. This child would be powerful, but she would know struggle. Both halves of that prophecy came true. Nzinga's father, Ngola Kiluanji, recognized something in his daughter early on. While her brother Ngola was groomed for the throne in the traditional manner, Nzinga was given something rare and dangerous for a woman of her era, an education, a real one. She sat in on councils, trained with warriors, studied military strategy, diplomatic protocol, and the political architecture that kept kingdoms standing when enemies pressed from every direction. She was, in every way that mattered, trained for war. The tragedy is that war came for her family first. When her father died around 1617, the throne was passed down to her brother, Ngolambandi, and the kingdom immediately started bleeding. Mbandi was not a bad man in the ordinary sense. He was simply the wrong man for this moment. He was paranoid, brutal in the way that frightened men often are, and militarily catastrophic. The Portuguese, who had been cautiously probing Ndongo's defenses for years, sensed the weakness like sharks sensing blood in water. They intensified their campaigns. Village after village fell. Ndongo's armies were routed again and again. Refugees, thousands of them, streamed into the interior, fleeing Portuguese raiders who moved with guns and chains. But the cruelest blow came not from the Portuguese. It came from Nzinga's own brother, Mbandi, terrified of anyone who might challenge his authority. Even within his family, murdered Nzinga's son, a child, his own nephew, eliminated as a potential rival before he was old enough to be a threat. And then, as if that were not enough, he banished Nzinga herself into exile. Exile is not just distance. It is the particular torture of watching something you love collapse in slow motion, close enough to see it happening, powerless to stop it. Nzinga knew her brother was losing. She knew the Portuguese were advancing. She knew her people were being taken. And every single day she spent beyond those borders was a day she had to live with the knowledge that she had the mind, the skill, and the will to change the outcome, and was being denied the chance to use any of it. Not by the enemy, but by her own blood, the same man who had her son killed. The same man now sitting on a throne he was actively destroying, surrounded by enemies he didn't know how to fight, making decisions that were costing thousands of people their freedom and their lives. For years, Nzinga waited. By 1621, the situation had become unsurvivable. The Portuguese held enormous swaths of territory. The kingdom was approaching collapse. Mbandi, desperate and out of options, swallowed his pride and sent a message to the sister he had wronged. He needed a diplomat. He needed someone who could walk into a room full of enemies and not flinch. He needed Nzinga. She came, not because she forgave him, not because she had forgotten what he did. She only came because her people needed her. And Nzinga had never put herself above her purpose. Governor João Correa de Souza agreed to this meeting with one assumption, that it would be easy. Ndongo was on its knees, its king was desperate. The envoy coming through that door was supposed to be a formality, a final quiet surrender dressed up as diplomacy. He had arranged the room accordingly. The elevated throne, the empty floor, and the absent chair. Everything designed to remind the African envoy of exactly where they stood before a single word was exchanged. What the governor had not accounted for was who was walking through that door. Then the delegation walks in. The moment Nzinga sat on her attendant's back, her posture imperial, her expression unreadable, her gaze meeting the governor's without a flicker of deference. She had already won the psychological war. She had turned their insult into her stage. She had forced an audience expecting submission to reckon with something they hadn't prepared for. A woman who simply refused to play the game on anyone else's terms. The negotiations that followed were nothing short of masterful. Nzinga was not there to beg. She proposed a treaty with the surgical precision of someone who had studied Portuguese motivations deeply. Ndongo would recognize Portuguese trading rights in exchange for withdrawal from occupied territories and formal recognition of the kingdom's sovereignty. She knew the Portuguese craved something beyond mere military victory. They wanted legal legitimacy. They wanted their conquests recognized by the kingdoms they conquered, to transform naked aggression into something that looked, on paper, like diplomacy. Nzinga offered them that veneer at a price. And she made one more move that shocked everyone in the room. She converted to Christianity, taking the baptismal name Dona Ana de Souza, named after the governor's own wife. Modern audiences sometimes read this as surrender. It was the opposite. It was armor. Once Ndongo's royal representative had embraced Catholicism, the Portuguese lost one of their most powerful ideological weapons, the claim that they were bringing civilization to pagans. You cannot civilize a Christian queen. It also opened diplomatic corridors that had previously been closed, allowing Nzinga to write letters directly to Portuguese officials and even the Vatican, framing future conflicts in a language European powers actually understood. She left Luanda with a signed treaty in hand: Portuguese withdrawal, recognition of Ndongo's borders. It looked like a miracle. It was a lie. The Portuguese had no intention of honoring a single word of that treaty. Within months, they resumed military operations exactly where they had left off. The truth was brutal. The negotiations had given them exactly what they needed: time to assess Ndongo's remaining military strength, intelligence about internal fractures, and space to prepare their next offensive. The treaty was never a peace agreement. It was a data collection exercise. For most leaders, this kind of betrayal destroys something. It breaks the faith that peace is possible, that words mean anything, that there is any path forward except submission. For Nzinga, it was a revelation. She had now seen the Portuguese for exactly what they were. She knew the rules of the game, and she was done playing it their way. Then, in 1624, her brother Angola Mbandi died. The historical record goes murky here. Some accounts say illness. Others suggest poison. What happened in the immediate aftermath, however, is crystal clear. Nzinga moved. She was not supposed to become queen. Ndongo's traditions did not permit female rulers. The Council of Elders, the Sobas, protested. The Portuguese, who had their own candidate in mind for a puppet king, protested. For one strange and poisonous moment, the African elders and the European colonizers found themselves in perfect agreement. They did not want this woman in power. Nzinga looked at all of them and presented a choice: accept her, or watch Ndongo vanish into Portuguese colonial records as a footnote. They accepted. The Portuguese launched their next major offensive in 1626, fully expecting to sweep a disorganized kingdom led by a female ruler with no military experience. It would be quick, it would be decisive, and it would be the end of Ndongo. They had fundamentally misread who they were fighting. Nzinga did not attempt to beat the Portuguese at their own game. She invented a new game entirely. She looked at the battlefield math honestly. Portuguese muskets and cannon would obliterate any traditional army she could field in an open confrontation. So, she eliminated open confrontations. What she built instead was something that military historians now recognize as a textbook example of asymmetric warfare. Centuries before that term was coined, her forces vanished into the landscape like smoke. They destroyed supplies before the Portuguese could seize them. They evacuated villages overnight, leaving Portuguese columns marching into ghost towns with nothing to eat and no one to enslave. They ambushed patrols on forest paths. They cut supply lines. They reappeared 50 miles away and struck again before anyone could respond. The Portuguese could take territory. They simply couldn't hold it. Every victory drained their resources and produced nothing. Every advance became a liability. But Nzinga was thinking on multiple levels simultaneously. She declared her territory a sanctuary for escaped slaves, an act of military genius disguised as moral courage. Every person who fled Portuguese captivity and reached her lands was a potential soldier, a source of intelligence about Portuguese operations, and proof to the wider region that Nzinga's territory meant freedom. It swelled her ranks, while simultaneously hemorrhaging the Portuguese labor force. Their entire economic model in Angola depended on captive bodies. Nzinga was draining them one escaped person at a time. In 1631, she made a move that secured her long-term survival. She led her forces to conquer the neighboring kingdom of Matamba. This was not opportunism. Matamba sat beyond the immediate reach of Portuguese military power. Connected to deep interior trade routes the Portuguese couldn't easily access or control. By seizing it, Nzinga gained strategic depth, a fortress kingdom where she could build, regroup, and project power from a position of genuine security. She was now queen of both Ndongo and Matamba, and she was just getting started. Here's what I need you to understand about this woman. She was doing all of this in her 40s, having survived exile, the murder of her child, the collapse of her home kingdom, and the betrayal of the one treaty she'd negotiated. And she was still somehow winning. Pause for 1 second. What do you think of what she's built so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Is this genius, or is it desperation that just looks like genius from the outside? I think it might be both, and that makes it even more impressive. By the 1640s, Nzinga had been fighting for nearly 2 decades. She was in her 60s, and she had never stopped. And then the geopolitical board shifted in a way that no one could have predicted. The Portuguese Empire was cracking at the seams. They were fighting to preserve independence from Spanish control in Europe. Their colonies in Brazil were burning with rebellion. And off the coast of Angola, a new fleet had appeared, flying the flag of the Dutch West India Company. The Dutch were not, they're out of conscience. They wanted to break Portugal's stranglehold on the Atlantic slave trade for their own commercial reasons. But they needed something the Portuguese didn't have. Allies inside Angola who knew the terrain, knew the enemy, and had been bleeding the Portuguese for 2 decades. They needed Nzinga. Nzinga needed guns, ammunition, European military technology, and the international legitimacy that came with being recognized as a partner by a major colonial power. The alliance they forged was brutally pragmatic and devastatingly effective. Starting in 1641, when the Dutch captured Luanda and expelled the Portuguese in a stunning military strike, Nzinga coordinated attacks from the interior, while Dutch forces held the coast. Together, they tore apart the Portuguese colonial infrastructure. For a brief, electrifying period, it genuinely looked like the Portuguese might lose Angola entirely. During these years, something else happened that historians still debate. Nzinga began leading her forces from the front lines personally, dressed in warrior garb, carrying weapons, insisting on being addressed with male royal titles in certain ceremonial contexts. Whether this reflected personal gender identity, calculated psychological warfare against enemies who struggled to process the idea of a female commander-in-chief, or political pragmatism in a patriarchal military culture, or some combination of all three. We cannot say for certain. What we can say is the effect it had. Portuguese governors sent increasingly panicked dispatches back to Lisbon. The letters describe a queen who fights like a general and governs like a statesman. They requested emergency reinforcements, more weapons, better funding. The most powerful empire in the Western world was writing desperate letters home about one African woman in her 60s who refused to be beaten. Think about that for a moment. Alliances of convenience don't last. By the early 1650s, the Portuguese and Dutch made their own accommodation, carving up their African interests in ways that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with profit. The Dutch pulled back. Nzinga, once again, was alone. She was now in her 70s. 3.5 decades of war. Multiple kingdoms lost and rebuilt. Exile, betrayal, loss, guerrilla campaigns, international diplomacy. She had outlasted governors, military commanders, and political calculations that had declared her finished dozens of times. A lesser person, man or woman, would have accepted the terms on offer. Comfortable retirement, a title without real power, the quiet surrender of someone who had simply run out of fight. Nzinga had not run out of fight, but she had also become wise enough to understand something that took her decades to fully learn. She did not need to destroy the Portuguese. She did not need a decisive military victory, which was likely impossible given their resources. She simply needed to make every single day of Portuguese occupation of Angola so expensive, so draining, and so unpleasant that the calculation of staying no longer made economic sense. It was a war of exhaustion, and she was extraordinarily good at it. Supply lines continued to be raided. Every Portuguese advance inland triggered immediate, costly guerrilla response. The slaves they sought kept escaping to her territory. The trade routes remained disrupted, and the dream of a profitable Angolan colony stayed perpetually out of reach. The ledgers in Lisbon told a story the governors in Luanda were too proud to say out loud. Angola was costing Portugal far more than it was earning, and the reason had one name. In 1656, the Portuguese blinked. They signed a new treaty, And this time it was real. Portugal formally recognized Nzinga as the legitimate queen of Ndongo and Matamba. They acknowledged her sovereignty over her territories. They agreed to define borders and mutual respect between equals. The Portuguese Empire, one of the two most powerful colonial empires on earth, officially, formally, in writing, recognized an African queen they had once refused to provide a chair for. 40 years after that moment in the governor's hall, she had her answer. Nzinga spent her final years doing something that rarely gets enough attention in the history books: building. After decades of pure survival, she turned her attention to reconstruction, restoring trade networks, negotiating diplomatic relationships on terms of genuine parity, and consolidating a kingdom that had been forged in the furnace of unrelenting conflict. She worked with Catholic missionaries on her own terms, maintaining her sovereign authority while managing the religious politics of her era with the same pragmatic intelligence she had always deployed. She died in December 1663, at approximately 80 years old. Let that number sit with you. 80 years old, in the 17th century, having personally commanded guerrilla campaigns, negotiated with European powers, survived exile and assassination, conquered kingdoms, buried enemies, and outlasted 4 decades of colonial military pressure. She was 80 years old, and she died a queen on her own land, having never surrendered. The Portuguese did eventually conquer Angola, but not until the late 19th century, more than 200 years after Nzinga's death. Her resistance didn't just buy time. It preserved culture, sustained identity, and proved something that mattered far beyond Angola's borders: that African kingdoms were not passive victims waiting for European history to happen to them. They were actors, they made choices, they fought back, and sometimes, against all odds, they won. Here is where history demands honesty, though, because Nzinga was not a saint, and reducing her to one would be doing her a disservice. She participated in the slave trade herself, raiding rival kingdoms and selling captives to fund her military campaigns. She ruled with autocratic power and was capable of eliminating opponents with ruthless efficiency. These are not footnotes. They are part of who she was. A leader navigating impossible choices in a world of impossible violence, making the brutal calculations that survival required. These contradictions don't diminish her. They make her real. They make her human, and they make the study of her life far more interesting than any simplified legend. In modern-day Angola, Nzinga's face appears on the national currency. Her statue stands in Luanda. Streets, schools, and government buildings bear her name. She is not just a historical figure. She is the anchor of national identity, the proof that Angola's story did not begin with colonization and will not be defined by it. Every movement that has ever resisted empire, every underdog who refused to accept the terms of their own defeat, every person who has ever walked into a room designed to humiliate them and refused to be humiliated, they all carry something of Nzinga band. She sat on a human throne and met the governor's eyes without blinking. She lost battles, survived exile, buried her child, and kept going. She made an empire negotiate with her as an equal. And in the end, she won not with a single brilliant battle, but with 40 years of refusing to stop. That's not just history. That's a blueprint. If this story hit you the way it hit me the first time I learned it, hit that like button. It genuinely helps more people find this content. And share it, because someone in your life needs to hear about this woman. Drop a comment and tell us which African historical figure you want us to cover next. The African continent is full of stories that mainstream history has buried. And we are just getting started. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The past is not dead. It's speaking, and it's time we listen.